Hello, everybody. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. I'm also very, very sorry that I can't make it in person. But tomorrow actually is the day that I have my first vaccination, and it seemed a little unwise to take this risk so very, very close to the finish. But I'm really pleased to be here, and I think the program looks really fabulous. And I'm really sorry I can see all the other things. So I'm a professor of sociology at the KU Leuven, and I've been working on the study of humor for a long time. Although you probably can hear it when I'm speaking English. I'm Dutch originally. I'm also in the Netherlands, and much of my research on humor was done in the Netherlands. So today I will talk to you about humor and othering. So latching on to the topic of your wonderful 3-day workshop program about between kidding and kindness, I'm giving an introduction about how humor works to establish boundaries between one group and the other. So how it serves to other people and how this is related to social relations. So I will give you some theoretical background on how humor works. I'll give you a specific case, and then I'll end with a number of dilemmas that I think you might be interested to talk about, not only with me, but also with other people during the remainder of these weeks, these days. So first of all, the program. So first I'll say something about what humor is, because humor is actually one of the most complicated forms of communications that human beings have. I specifically look at how humor others, and I will use a case study. My apologies, I'm not sure where that came from. I'll talk about what I see as a changing humor regime, so a very quick shift in how people have started to think about humor. And I think this might be what has given rise to the workshop that you have now. And then some questions under the sort of header of, aren't we even allowed to joke anymore? Which I think is something that we hear quite a lot in many different languages, where people are complaining that, everything used to be so nice and so funny, we could just have a wonderful sense of fun. And then all of a sudden, we're not even allowed to joke anymore. Before I go, is all well? Can you hear me? Is the technique going well? Is there anything I should change? Okay. Excellent. Thank you so much. So the first question is, what is humor? Which is actually very difficult to answer. So I think many people will find that if they try to define what humor is, if they try to capture it, that they will sort of be at a loss for words and not really able to figure out what it is that makes them laugh. And if you can't think through that, it's actually also very difficult to understand why something that is funny to one person is not funny to another. So very briefly, humor is what makes us laugh. But what makes us laugh actually is extremely complicated. And I like to say it's really an everyday miracle that we manage to pull off what is really an extremely complicated form of communication that draws upon a very, very large amount of cultural knowledge that is something that we do every day. So I think the first thing to remember or to understand if you think about humor is that it helps to think of the way that bats find its way in the world, because humor and laughter to a very large extent can be likened to how bats find their way, and I'm sure you may know. So what bats do is they use this signal, so they use an echoing signal where they send out sort of signals all the time, and on the basis of the echo, they know where they are and where they're going. To a very large extent, humor functions like this. It's human beings, very, very deeply social beings, constantly sending out signals to the social world around them, trying to figure out if they're on the same page with other people. So what you do when you joke, when you try to tell a joke, is to figure out, do these people see the same world as I do? Do they understand things in the same way? So it's a way to test if people are literally on the same page. So if you tell a joke and it works well, it will be rewarded. You will get the echo of laughter or of a smile or of a nod. And if your joke falls flat or dies, as comedians say, that means that you haven't been able to achieve this echo. So that also explains why it feels so bad if you tell a joke and it falls flat. So comedians, I think you might hear about this more, literally call this dying on stage, because it's a moment where you discover that you're not on the same page with people. So it's a very complicated form of communication that is really, above all else, is to figure out if people belong to the same group, if they are like you. So instead of a definition, and many people have tried to give definitions of humor, but that's actually very, very difficult. So I've made a list of 5 of the ingredients of humor. And these 5 ingredients is something that you see in humor around the world. So the first is, and I think this already came through in my definition of humor as being like the sonar of a bat, is that humor is deeply social, and it's connected with the very sociable expression and emotion of laughter. So humor is not the only way, but it's the most common and most preferred way of eliciting laughter in others, which not only is a pleasant experience, but also if you manage to make someone else laugh, it's a very pleasant experience because it has a very strong expression of togetherness. And if you are laughing with others, then people who are not in on the laughter tend to feel excluded. And this is something that I think we all recognize, that the moment that you, for instance, you enter a large room and there will be people laughing on the other side of the room, there is a slight sense of discomfort. So you want to know what's going on there. So there's something in a group of people laughing together that really establishes them as together, having fun, as in a way as it establishes their groupness. And this is something that people want to belong to. So the social aspect of humor and the connection with laughter is one of the ingredients. So the second ingredient is that humor is always based on what specialists call incongruity. So humor is based on on something that doesn't exactly fit, so that somehow breaks the pattern of expectation. So you see this really clearly in jokes where, a man comes into a bar and he walks into a bar again, and the third time something odd happens that doesn't make sense and then makes sense in another way. But actually, if you start to look at it, really all forms of humor are based on a break of a pattern of expectation. So something happens that doesn't make sense but does make sense in another more humorous way. And that's actually a very complicated form of cognition, in the sense that you have to share the same understanding of what is expected and what is not expected in order to appreciate how a joke works. The third element is non-seriousness. Non-seriousness means that humor, in essence, is a form of play. So many mammals, as I assume you know, play, which means that they can have shared interactions which are based on sort of mock versions of other things, like mock fighting, for instance, is a form of play. And what you can do is signal that it's like something, but it's not the real thing. So it's not to be taken seriously. It's not to be believed. And what humor does, it's a cognitive or a symbolic form of play. So it's a play with meanings. And you signify that you're not serious. That's only a joke, that is not meant to be believed, by a number of signals, for instance, doing something with your face, but also by showing that you're really very different from other people. So there are many signals, but very often these signals can be very subtle, and you have to know that something is, that someone behaves in a certain way to read this person as a joke. And also, as I think that's something that comes up a lot in the current discussion about whether humor is okay or not, is you can actually also use this as a cop-out. So you can sort of say something and then leave it sort of ambivalent if you're joking or not. And depending on how it's received, or if people get angry, you can sort of cop out and say, no, but I was only joking. So non-serious means that the meaning of what you say is somehow between quotation marks. And that can be done in many ways. And actually most of everything, all humor has this aspect of non-seriousness. So the third, and now you see why humor is really complicated, is humor is very often, not always, but very often transgressive. So in this combination of non-seriousness, sociability, and incongruity, very often it means that not only things are unexpected in a cognitive way, but unexpected in the sense that they break taboos, that they touch on things that are painful, that they transcend societal boundaries. So it means that many jokes have to do with things that are supposed to be a little sensitive or complicated, like sex or gender relations or body fluids, that they play on gender normativity, as you can see here. So very often humor just is a very careful dosage between going just a bit further than is allowed societally, but not too much, because then it's not funny anymore and then it's painful. But that's, of course, also something where people are not in agreement about, not even in the same culture. And then finally, because of this non-seriousness, humor always very often also touches on, so appeals to a sense of superiority. So that means very often it pokes fun at something. So it pokes fun at something that might be prestigious, like in this case, the King of the Netherlands, who is, as you can see, not taken entirely seriously. So what humor does, it flattens things, it degrades things, because if you take something not completely seriously, it means that you make it less important, that you look down upon. So there is very often a sense of superiority in humor, in the sense that if you laugh at something or you laugh at someone, you elevate yourself above this. Now, as you can imagine, with a combination of these things, all of in themselves are actually quite complicated. It has to do with group boundaries. It has to do with what is expected and not. It has to do with what is allowed and not. It has to do with being not serious in relation to something else, which means that humor is an unusual, complex, and ambiguous form of human interaction. And what it does, because of this complexity and ambiguity, it marks and reinforces group boundaries. So humor is a very strong way of understanding. If you can understand that what I'm saying, this is joking, it means that you are like me, that we see the world in the same way. And it also means that we are sort of together, feel not only like a tiny conspiracy, but also slightly better than many of the others. So it marks and reinforces group boundaries, and it does so in a way that is complicated because it's at the same time subtle. So it's very difficult to point out why it is so painful that people joke and you're not in on the joke. But it's also very strong because of the very strong sense of togetherness that is created. So humor is really, it's a miracle. It's an everyday miracle that every single person dozens of times every day is able to create a joke without thinking about it, doing it in such a way, reaching other people who will understand it, and sort of feeling that you're on the same page. And this leads also, and that's where the problem comes in, it leads to othering, inclusion and exclusion on the basis of social identity and background, because humor is such a strong marker of seeing the world in the same way. It also means that everybody who is defined or has felt as slightly different for these persons, it will be more difficult to gain access to this in-group thing. So othering sometimes can be an accidental by effect of, people just, being on the same page, but also it can sometimes be a much more open, overt way of excluding people. So I've written about this, and this is where the title of this talk comes from, which is the title that I haven't suggested myself. It comes from a study that I published 5 years ago with one of my students at the time about ethnic humor and social change, or ethnic humor and ethnic relations. And what I think is interesting there is, if you look at the Dutch situation, you see that jokes about ethnic groups are not only very prevalent and very dominant. So we collected jokes. So I collected jokes first in the 1990s for my own MA thesis, and then we did it again over almost 20 years later with the students. And you can see that what humor does, and I'll show it here, is that jokes, so we're talking about moppen here, so canned jokes, is that jokes very strongly follow the social hierarchy, both in the sense that the lower a specific group is in the social hierarchy, the more jokes there will be about this group, and also the harsher the jokes will be about this group. And you can see that over time, as specific groups became more marginalized and came to the fore, they actually more jokes evolved around them. So we see that jokes in many different can actually be very active ways of excluding out groups, ridiculing them to foster a sense of self-identity. Now, how this works is something that I want to show you with a specific case. So there are many different cases. I'm sure you can think of many moments when you felt that humor has played a role in this process of othering, that is excluding and including on the basis of identity. And I suppose this is also one of the reasons that you organized this symposium in the beginning, because this is something that you can feel specifically in mixed, international, diverse societies, where you can very easily feel how humor is one of the ways in which people sort of stick together and other people feel excluded. So there's one case that I want to share with you. I will not share the joke, but it's easy to find if you want to, but I'll explain enough about it to understand it. And I suppose many of you will have heard about it because it was it hit the news quite dramatically. And it's this. So it's a song that was made about, so if this would have been live, unfortunately, I would have asked you if you know this. So this is a song that came up around Carnival of 2020. So just last year as the COVID pandemic started hitting, and there was a Carnival song, which was called in Dutch voorkomen, actually it's not right here, is beter dan genezen, which is a pun on prevention is better than curing, but it's also on Chinese, which is Chinezen. So it was a joke about about how the COVID pandemic at that time was still something that the Chinese brought to us. And I think that the clear senses that I picked out here from the subtitled version is we don't need that in our country. We moeten dat niet hebben in ons land. And it was a carnival song. So it's a very specifically understandable form of singing which is supposed to be very funny in a sort of outrageous way. It comes with a lot of punning, lots of jokes about Chinese. It was sung in an audience with people laughing. So in many different ways, this had all the ingredients that we know that I just described of humor. So this was in-crowd, in-group humor, joking. It was a little transgressive. So all of the things that we see was humor. It was, let's be very clear. So by the sort of standards of but it was also very clear that many people didn't think it was very funny because it was offensive, because it was insulting, because it excluded a specific group. It was about a pandemic. It was seen as a new form of anti-Asian racism that we see a lot. So this is an interesting case to think through how this othering works through humor, and also why it's so difficult, and I think that's important, why it's so difficult to do something about this. So first, think about the song, and I suppose if you haven't heard it, I think you get the gist of the thing. It's easy to find. There are also translations on YouTube, so subtitled version. So how does this song mark boundaries? So first of all, very clearly, if we think of the 5 ingredients, it leads to laughing together with those who understand the jokes. So you can see it in the original clip, but also in the way that it was usually received, is that this is really funny. It leads to a very strong sort of raucous laughter with those who understand, who are in on the joke. So it's a very, very strong way of provoking this sense of humor is something, of a group of people being together, laughing at a specific thing and sort of having this bat effect. We are on the same page. Look at how we're all having fun about this specific joke. So it's social, it's a pleasant feeling, and it's a sense of groupness that is produced by this. And obviously, just this sort of laughing together can be really unpleasant for those who don't find this particularly funny. It's very, as I said, it can be very uncomfortable to be with people who are laughing at something and you're like, I don't really think this is funny. Is there something about me? Why am I laughing? So it's just not being in on the joke in itself can be a very painful experience because it touches on the sort of the core of our social being. So this is really a feeling that should not be underestimated in the so it has been described as a form of social pain. So second, it is based on incongruity and resolution because it's based, first of all, on a knowledge of a Dutch colloquialism. Voorkomen is based on genezen, so it's a pun, but also the entire song is full of these sorts of references that you have to be able to understand and decode, for which you need not only to understand Dutch, but also to have knowledge of a number of references that Dutch people will immediately know. So voorkomen is beter dan genezen is not a particularly, dan Chinees is not a particularly strong pun, but it has this sort of joke structure. So it's wrong, but then it's right in a different way. So thirdly, very clearly, there are many ways in which this is framed as non-serious. So think of the guy with the kettle on his head. So there are many forms of non-serious framing that really make it clear that this is a joke. So there is the accent of the singers, there's a specific form of music, which is carnival music, which really denotes fun and joking, and it's a very specific. So there are many forms of humorous keying here that are all really easy to pick up for natives. So if you're Dutch, so from the first bar, you will know immediately that this is supposed to be funny. And this is also, and actually this also opens up this domain of freedom, because it's just a joke. We can say all these sorts of things that you're not supposed to say. So that brings about the fourth element of the transgressive references. So obviously you're not supposed to say these things about Chinese people. It's not even clear if you're supposed to joke about illnesses, maybe not so much, although it wasn't that clear over a year from now. So there are many references that people know you should not do, but the fact that you do it and you don't go too far, so it's not real aggression. You don't say, you don't say the most terrible things about Chinese. You just say somewhat terrible things about Chinese. So there's a very careful dosage of going over a boundary, but not too far. So it's just the right dosage for a specific group of natives in the context of this carnival feeling. And then we have the element of superiority or hierarchy that I refer to. So it is a clear example of laughing down at a group that in the Dutch society doesn't have a very dominant position. So it's also not a group that is completely marginalized or stigmatized, but it's definitely a group of people that has been, so Chinese in the Netherlands have been around for a long time. They're recognized as not the most stigmatized, so not on the level of, as you saw from the table, the Moroccans, for instance, but definitely also lower in the ethnic hierarchy than the native Dutch. So all the elements are there, and you can see how if you add all this up, there is a strong pattern where it's us Dutch versus them Chinese, and maybe also us Rotterdam jovial Dutch against them Chinese, and also all them others who are too politically correct to enjoy this harmless bit of fun. So there is a double politics in there in marking boundaries. And what it highlights is that it's actually, I think this is very important, because that it's extremely difficult to respond to a joke at your expense. And that's one of the reasons why the boundary marking is so very subtle and so effective, because there are actually not a lot of good ways to respond. So one of the things you can do, which is also something that happened last year, is to go to the judge. So this, as the Chinese community sues or litigates because of discriminating and hate inciting song. So this is one of the things you can do. The other thing you can do is joke back. So this is this says the Chinese answer, prevention is better than Holland, Radio 10. And one of the things in sort of typical Chinese-ish font is Heineken, you can't call that beer. So that's another way. So you can joke back. But I think both of them are slightly problematic in the sense that, I mean, the joke is still there, and I think we would probably agree that the second part would be slightly more dignified than the others, maybe joking back or maybe not. But the problem always when there is a joke at the expense of you as a person or as a group is that it's very difficult to respond with dignity. So to respond in a way that will be perceived as stylist or classy, or a way to sort of maintain your social status and your social standing and a good feeling about yourself. So this is also something, so I'm just giving this as an introduction, something that I wrote about in several articles. So one, I did an analysis of the Danish cartoon controversy, which is already 15 years ago, but I think which has really changed the way we think about this. And I made an analysis of satire and dignity, where I specifically looked at the different forms of ways in which to respond. And what I show in the second article is that what you can do, you can laugh along with the joke at your expense, which is not a very nice feeling, but it's something that conventionally happened. You can joke back, so that's the response of making the counter song, which is actually can be very classy, but you have to have a lot of power and social organization to be able to pull this off. You can argue. So you can say that's not funny, which is very difficult. You can retaliate. So like in a serious way. So for instance, go to the judge, which also is something that is not available to all. You can show anger, which is usually seen as loss of face, or you can do nothing and withdraw. So basically all of these options, this is what you have available. And typically many of these options are either psychologically unsatisfactory or sort of tend to reinforce your low social status. So it is a predicament that is very, very difficult to escape from. And I think this is exemplified by a joke that I very often tell to show how difficult it is to do something about this. So this is, I'm not sure if you're aware of the cycle of light bulb jokes. So this is an English language cycle. How many somethings does it take to screw in a light bulb? So one of the jokes is how many feminists does it take to screw in a light bulb? So this joke refers to the fact that feminists are supposed to not have a sense of humor, like the Muslims after the cartoon crisis, and maybe also like Chinese when they complained about the jokes, and not only this one. And the answer is, that's not funny. So that's a joke that I tell to great success in many talks, but it exemplifies something really painful in the sense that saying that something is not funny when it's a joke at your expense is considered in itself as a bad answer. So it's typical of humorless people that don't know how to deal with the joke. But painfully, it also illustrates that people with a marginalized or less powerful social position actually can't really do much. So they will say, I don't particularly enjoy it that you joke about me like this because, I don't really like it. And then you don't have a sense of humor. And not having a sense of humor is also supposed to be a loss of face. So the interesting thing, and I think this is really the heart as many of the debates that we have now, is that we feel that it's really bad to reject a joke. So if someone makes a joke at your expense, so what is expected is that you laugh along always, even when you're a woman or when you're a feminist or when you're Chinese or when you whatever. And if you don't have a sense of humor. And that's actually interesting because what I would like to invite you to do in the remainder of this talk is to think through why it is so bad to reject a joke and why it's such a horrible thing to not have a sense of humor, to the point that people will, go to great length and sort of laugh along at jokes because they don't want to show that they don't have a sense of humor. And what I want to sort of suggest to you is that we have in contemporary European and North American societies, and I've actually studied this in the Netherlands, but also in various European countries and in the US, we have a humor regime where having a sense of humor is seen as a very, very central part of your personality and really the core of how you're supposed to behave to others. And that this humor regime is changing now because it is challenged in a number of different ways. So this humor regime sets the informal rules of humor in contemporary European and North American cultures. So this is sort of understanding that we have of what humor is, how you should use it, and how you should respond to it. And there is actually so much consensus about this humor regime that it's very easy if you go for memes that you can actually sort of explain it in memes that are, very prevalent everywhere. So one of the memes that we have is Good sense of humor, and I think it's interesting that this is very often reiterated. So it shows that this is a rule that needs some reinforcement. So it's better to tell a joke at the expense of yourself, or to joke about people in charge or in leadership positions, but not to punch down. That would be so. We understand the problem of humor, and we solve it by saying, don't joke at people who don't have a powerful position. So actually, if you remember the table that I showed, it's actually a rule that we don't really stick to that much. But this is one of the ways that we've tried to cope with the problems of humor as a form of communication that on the one hand we like and we really appreciate, but we see that it has some problematic things. So we have a rule. So the other thing is that humor is a very good thing. I think this is very central to the humorism. So you got to keep a sense of humor, because humor is very good. So even if people joke at you and you're Chinese and you got to be able to smile. So humor is good because it shows something very central about your personality. And the third thing is that it's really, if it's just a joke, you should be able to take it. Keep calm. It's just a joke. If people are joking at your expense, then you should be able to take it, because the joke is not serious, people, so you should not take it. And interestingly, what we see is that all of these elements have been challenged increasingly over the past decade or so. And interestingly, mostly after the Danish cartoon crisis, we saw that many of these maxims of how to think about humor have been challenged quite a bit. So we also see that humor is seen as a very important social and political corrective. So I'm sure you've heard of Charlie Hebdo, the French magazine, which sort of proudly presents itself as an irresponsible newspaper, whereas a responsible newspaper would mean an end to laughter. So humor is also seen as an important critique, as a counterforce to power. And finally, it means that if you're authentic, then you shouldn't fall for political correctness. So the rules that people try to establish when it comes to humor. So if you're a real, authentic, strong individual, you should really continue joking even when you know some people won't like that, because, political correctness and sort of controlling yourself would be a terrible idea. And I think what we're changing is interesting. And really, for me, this is really fascinating, because I've been studying humor for a long time now. So ever since my master's thesis, so we're talking about the early 90s, so this is a long time ago. And I saw that it was the same set of normative rules around humor. So people were reiterating, you have to be able to take a joke. It's good to have a sense of humor. It's really not very nice to complain about this, because you should be able to take it. And over the past years, I've seen a change in this humor regime. So, and that means that humor has emerged as a contested arena in the so-called culture wars. And I'm sure that you've seen this, because it hits universities specifically everywhere in Europe and the US. It's also sometimes referred as cancel culture, which I think is a horrible mistake. So what happens, first of all, is that we see emancipation processes. So we see that for a long time there was a division of labor, you could say, where some people had a lot of freedom to tell jokes. So for instance, men would tell jokes about women, white people would tell jokes about non-whites. So all of these older people will tell jokes about younger people. So there was a very clear division of labor that you could actually see is, some people have all the freedom to tell jokes, and then many others are expected to sort of laugh along. And I think with gender, this is the clearest example, that for a long time, it's still, humor is supposed to be something that men do well, and women are supposed to be laughing at men's jokes. I think that's mostly, and increasingly women have been saying, well, we don't particularly enjoy this, and we would, we can also be funny, so why don't you give the floor to us? And also, by the way, we don't really enjoy it that you joke about women all the time. And this is a very quick shift, and these emancipation processes actually is a moment where some people with a lot of power to joke were challenged by people with much less power to joke, and you actually see a more even division of joking and being joked at. And this is something that we see with gender very specifically, also with sexual minorities, but also increasingly, I would say, with people who are of non-white or non-native descent. So the second thing that we see in the culture wars, and this has really made this much stronger, is the rise of social media. So social media have changed another division of labor, where you have the people who were making jokes in public, had control over the audiences, were the comedians on the stage or the comedians with the TV screens, and everybody else who was just the audience. And in social media, first of all, the audience has started talking back. And there have been many more people who have been trying to be funny. So again, the spread of both deciding what is funny and to be funny, and the spread of and the spread of this is, I'll explain you later. This was actually a very interesting explanation of what just happened, illustration. So the spread of people who can be funny, but also the capacity to contest jokes and to talk back, means that comedians have lost their monopoly very much on deciding what is funny, because everybody has the access to the public arena, including calling out people for joking. What also has happened, and I think that is what I call context collapse. And context collapse is actually exactly what happened just now when my son was crying behind the door. Because what happens with social media is that so many forms of humor were relying on the fact that there is, small groups where you with a specific group of friends, where you can share a number of transgressive jokes because it's among your circle of friends. So many of the jokes, for instance, that we collected about ethnic minorities in the Netherlands, everybody knew that the jokes couldn't be told in public spheres, but you will tell them with your friends in the football canteen, or with your colleagues, or in a bar, or in a family gathering. So you can tell many jokes that you can tell them in a private sphere, but not in a public sphere. But what social media does is collapse all these contexts. So you can tell a joke, what you think would be a very nice joke for your friends, but then it's Facebook, and your colleagues will be there, and your boss, and your grandmother, and your aunt that you haven't seen forever. So context, and so the private-public distinction that is really important for maintaining this sort of tiny conspiracy feel is also collapsing. And that also has made humor more contested, in the sense that this, now we can tell a joke about Turks or Moroccans because we know who we are, but there are not really that many situations where we know where we are. And that means that people will call you out, and that you will have to do something about this. So the contexts that used to be very nicely separated have collapsed. And then finally, increasingly over the past few years, you've seen social and political polarization, where people have used jokes to really actively provoke people into sort of showing them, in sort of highlighting the conflicts. So, and I'm sure you're aware of specifically the alt-right that really has used humor as a way to sort of provoke people and to create very specific, outlandish sort of forms of groupness based on telling jokes that many people would really find offensive. So social and political polarization has also led to humor being at the heart of many of the debates, including some people claiming the right to joke about everything, and other people, mostly on the left, but also in the center, increasingly saying, there are really problems with some sorts of conclusion. So the conclusion being the common complaint that I think many of you have heard in many different languages: mag je dan nergens meer een grapje over maken? Aren't we even allowed to joke anymore? Because that's the question that we often hear when we talk about these sort of increasing awareness, that you could say, about how humor may be exclusive or how it may other, and also this change in humor regime that we see. So aren't we allowed to joke anymore? And I think the first answer, yes, we are, but there's the real and the growing possibility that your audience will not like it. So that's one of the things. So with these context collapse and this increasing awareness of how it works, it will be more and more likely that people will push back, which is okay, right? I mean, in the context of freedom of speech, you may joke, but then other people may have the freedom to say that they don't like it. But I think this is something that many people see as a spoil sport. So yes, we are, but the other thing is, so you may be confronted with pushback. And increasingly, sometimes you need to apologize. So this is something that's also, so you can still joke, but maybe people will not like it and will expect you to say, I'm sorry, or to sort of withdraw your joke. And this comes with a dilemma. Because the joker is not in charge of the real meaning of their joke. So that's increasingly, if you say it's just a joke, we will not accept that at face value. But then again, neither is the recipient. So you cannot say, I don't think this is funny, I don't like this, and then everybody shoots up joking. So how to balance these interpretations? So if it's not the joker who is right, so is the most aggrieved always right? So the person who is hurt most, and is that the way we want to go? So this is the first dilemma. The second, yes, we are still allowed to joke, of course, but there's more risk in a globalized social media world that it might end up with someone who really, really does take offense. And to have a very dramatic example of Charlie Hebdo, but there are also much less dramatic examples of a joke that was meant to be private and that has gone rampant, and then people will take offense. And this comes with another real dilemma. So what if people become afraid of joking in public? And there are some signs that we see now. For instance, the New York Times, which last year stopped, 2 years ago, stopped running all editorial cartoons. So saying we will stop with using humor altogether because it's just too complicated. And that is maybe also not what we want. So what do we want then? So the real dilemma, and this is where I want to end, is how to keep the good things of humor, because humor has a number of really proven very good things, while alleviating the possibly bad things, including hurting othering people, in a phenomenon that is so slippery, that is so difficult to touch, where good and bad are both ambiguous, apologies for the typo, and closely intertwined. So humor can do good things, but even the sort of the group cohesive things also is something that can be a bad thing. And so the good and the bad are both there, and they're also very closely connected. And in thinking this through, how should we wake the interest and feelings of different groups? So who is right? So it's definitely not the sort of white male older jokers that always have had the opportunity to joke about everything. But obviously it's not the opposite, that everybody's unhappy should get their way and stop people joking. And then the final question, this is actually even more complicated. Can we even influence this process? And if so, how, in what direction? So what should we do if we have the opportunity to change how we think about humor? And we're not even sure if it has, but then what should we do? So this is actually a number of questions for which there are no simple, easy answers. So this is really something that will require concerted thinking, and I hope that's what you will do in the next few days. So I thank you for your attention.